Parshas Vayishlach, an introduction to Hanukkah. We find a very fascinating connection in Parshas Vayishlach to Hanukkah, which is something that we wouldn't normally associate the two together. Parshas Vayishlach, Hanukkah, thousands of years later. But there is a fascinating connection. It says, Vayivasa Yaakov levadoi. We know that Yaakov Avinu, that he went back, and that night where he was split the camps, and he was waiting in trepidation for Esav. He was davening. He split the camps. He was prepared himself for Doiron, for a Matona, Tefillah, and Melchama. And he went back to retrieve these Pachim Ketanim, these small containers. The Das Kenim says, Al Tikre Levadoi Ela Lekadoi. Don't read it Levadoi, that he was left alone, but he went Lekadoi for his pitcher. Which pitcher? The Kad Shemen. The Kad Shemen that was used for the Hashmanoim. They found this Pach Shemen, they found this pitcher of oil, this flask, this container of oil, sealed with the seal of the Kohen Gadol, that the Shemen of Nes, that did not consume, that replenished itself. That's what he went back for. And the Sisei Kohen explains, he says, when Yaakov Avinu had put the stones around him, and then they were under his head, he was left with one kind of shemen, sealed, betara. And then he wanted to be menasech shemen, he wanted to be menasech oil, pour oil, on this matzeva that he built. In the practice of nisuch, of nesochim, of libations, he wanted to pour oil on this matzeva that he made, and the oil was replenished. The miraculous oil that it was replenished, and it was not depleted. He went back, he was Meiser Nefesh to retrieve this Pach Shemen. And as the Marshal says, the Rabbeinu Shalom said, you are Meiser Nefesh to retrieve this Pach Shemen. Your children, your descendants, the Hashmanoim, will have this Pach Shemen through which the great Nes of Hanukkah will occur and the oil will not be depleted. What's the hezir? What's the explanation for this? Furthermore, the Sifsei Kohen says this Pach Shemen was the same Pach Shemen that was used to anoint, to do Mashiach in the Mishkan, for the Kalim of the Mishkan. It was the same Pach Shemen that was used for the Mashiach, for Malachim, for the kings, for the Malchei Yisrael. It was the same Pach Shemen that was a Pach Shemen of Nes, for the Nes that occurred for Eliyahu Novi and Elisha Novi. This miraculous Pach Shemen, what we find throughout history, that the Pach Shemen was used, and on various occasions the oil was not depleted. This miracle, this Nes, that the oil was not depleted. Perhaps the explanation is as follows. We know there's a very famous Rav Elchanan in Kavitz Mamorim. He explains the difference between Purim and Hanukkah. And we know that in Purim, Klal Yisrael's response to the sakana, to the danger that they faced, was very different than by Hanukkah. At Purim, by Purim time, it was sak ve'efer, it was fasting, it was tshuva, it was crying out to the Rabbeinu Shalom. It was tanis. That was the response. Mordechai and Esther, they encouraged the people. They were able to influence them to be chayzer b'tshuva, and they were makabel ter ba'ava. That was the response. Torah, tefillah, tshuva. By Hanukkah, it's quite different. By Hanukkah, they went to war. They waged the battle. The odds were stacked against them in both cases. The likelihood of them conquering the Greeks, the likelihood of them conquering the Persians, the odds were stacked against them in both cases. It was a miracle. It was an ace. So why was the response so different? Why was it that by Purim time it was tshuva, tefillah, Torah, and by Hanukkah it was milchama? It was a war. It was a battle. Zok Rav Elchanan, there's two types of Puronis that come upon Klal Yisrael, Rachmana litzlan. When the Rabbi Shalom wants Klal Yisrael to be chayzer b'tshuva, when they've sinned, when they're a chayta, and they have to be chayzer b'tshuva, so the Kadosh Baruch Hu brings upon them Rachmana litzlan, atzara, a calamity, punishment, danger, in order to motivate them, to instill in them the ratzon to be chayzer b'tshuva. It now sends a message to them, and it helps them to follow the right path. That's the koyach hatoiv. And when the koyach hatoiv is shlit in the world, if there has to be a tikkun, if Klal Yisrael has to correct themselves, has to amend their ways, then there is a tzorah that's sent, but the nature of the tzorah is to encourage them to do tshuva, and it's not a tzorah that is mevatel Torah. If this is coming from the koyach hatoiv, the koyach hatoiv is not mevatel Torah. So there aren't gzeras that will cause Klal Yisrael not to be able to learn Torah. They're not gzeras and tzaras that will close the yeshivas, Rachmana litzlan. There won't be takanas not to keep mitzvahs, not to keep Shabbos. That's not the koyach hatoiv. That's a koyach hara. If they're gzeras neged the guf, neged the body, neged the guf of Klal Yisrael, the gashmi of Klal Yisrael, those are punishments, those are messages that are coming koyach hatoiv and telling Klal Yisrael to be chayzer b'tshuva. And that's what happened. That's what happened at the time of Purim. The takanas were not against the Torah. The gzeras were not against Shabbos. It wasn't against Chasana and Bris Milah. It was against their bodies. It was against the physical body of Klal Yisrael, the gzeras lahashmid laharik, Rachmana litzlan. Those are messages from the koyach hatoiv which demand a response, which elicit a response of tshuva, of tefillah, of Torah, and that's what happened in Purim. The gzera was a gzera against the guf of Klal Yisrael, against the physical part of Klal Yisrael. It wasn't against the shmiras hamitzvahs of Klal Yisrael. It wasn't against the Torah of Klal Yisrael, and therefore the response was tshuva and tefillah, and that overcomes the takana. And that's what happened by Purim. But Zok Rav Elchanan, there's another type of tzara. There's one that comes where it's gzeras or Rachmana litzlan against shmiras hamitzvahs, against chasanas, against the mishpachas of Klal Yisrael, against the ruchnias of Klal Yisrael that tries to instill tumah into Klal Yisrael, against Shabbos, against Bris Milah. That's what happened at the time of the Yavonim. The Yavonim tried to instill tumah into Klal Yisrael. It wasn't a gzera lahashmid or laharik. It was a gzera against the ruchnias of Klal Yisrael, the tahara of Klal Yisrael, the kedusha of Klal Yisrael. That's what was the gzera at the time of Hanukkah. And that, Zok Rav Elchanan, the source of that is the koyach hara. And sometimes the koyach hara is given shlit in the world. Sometimes the koyach hara has the power, has, so to speak, the upper hand, has the power to rule over the world and impose itself on the world and control the world. Sometimes the world is under the dominion of the koyach hara. And sometimes in Shemayim, these koichas hara are given rule. To a certain degree, they're given rule. And therefore they can control the world. And the response to that, the response to fight, the koichas hara, the koichas hara that are trying to destroy the Torah, destroy good, destroy Kedusha and Tahara, the response to that is Mesiras Nefesh. Mesiras Nefesh for Kedusha and Tahara. To give up our lives for it. To be nicer Nefesh. That's what's demanded. In those situations where the Koichas Hara, where they rule, where they have dominion, where they have the upper hand, are imposing their Gzeras and Takonas, trying to destroy the Torah, trying to destroy Kedusha and Tahara, inject Tumah into our world, the whole world, into Klal Yisrael, the response that's demanded is Mesiras Nefesh. And that's what happened at Hanukkah. They were Meiser Nefesh. The odds of victory were slim to none. The odds were stacked against them. But what was demanded was pure Mesiras Nefesh, without a cheshbon Mesiras Nefesh. And therefore that brought about the nes. And that is reflective in the second nes. Not only the nes of the Milchama, not only the miracle that they won, they overcame the army of the Greeks, but in the second nes as well with the Pach HaShemen. When Klal Yisrael are Meiser Nefesh, L'man, Kedushas Hashem, when they're Meiser Nefesh, L'man, the Rebbeinu Shalom V'Teirosai, when it's demanded, and they rise to the challenge and they're Meiser Nefesh to uphold the Tahara and the Kedusha and fight the Koichas of Tumah and Koichas of Ra, then the Teva becomes subordinate and they rule over the Teva. And Klal Yisrael rules over nature, which is reflective in the nes of the Pach HaShem, and the oil did not get depleted. That was the Shemen of Yaakov Avinu. That was the Pach, the Kad of Yaakov Avinu. That was the foundation that Yaakov Avinu, that he set and he implanted in Klal Yisrael. Yaakov Avinu was Meiser Nefesh to fulfill Rivka's desires, wishes to take the brachas. He risked his life. He risked his life with Esau. He ran away, and he risked his life with Lavan. He was Meiser Nefesh to get this kad, to bring this kad, for the Nesochim, for the Matseva, to bring this kad, to be Oved Hashem, to bring this kad, to have it as the inheritance and legacy of Klal Yisrael, that they too are capable of having shalita, dominion over Teva, and to be able to fight the Koichas Hara with their Mesiras Nefesh, and be shlit over Teva, to have that Pach HaShemen. The Malchei Yisrael, they had Mashiach, they were anointed with it, because their tafkid is to fight the Koichas Hara, and even to the extent when they have to be Meiser Nefesh and go to battle and go to war. The Mishkan is anointed with this Shemen, because that's the source and the foundation of Kedusha and Tahara, to spread out over the world, and from there, that should be the source of Kedusha, Tahara, emanating and spreading throughout the whole world. Elisha and Navi, Eliyahu and Navi were Meiser Nefesh against the Rishoim of Achav and the Oivei Zora and the Oivei Abal. They had that Pach HaShemen. Hashmonaim, they were Meiser Nefesh for Kedushas Am Yisrael. They were Meiser Nefesh for Taras Am Yisrael, and they had that Pach HaShemen, the Pach HaShemen of Yaakov Avinu. And when Klal Yisrael is called upon to be Meiser Nefesh, we also can be Zoicha to things Lamala Min HaTeva. Things Lamala Min HaTeva that would not be anticipated and could not be expected. Many years ago, when the Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael was just getting developed, the Yishuv of the Shemer Torah mitzvahs that was really starting to really get on its feet, when they started to have chadorim, to build chadorim for for the Yiddish Kinder, to have schools for the less affiliated, to have day schools for the less affiliated. When the Frum community in Eretz Yisrael was getting on its feet and starting to build networks of moisters, of chadorim, and day schools, and there was a big shaila. At that time, it was in the early years, and in the early years of the community in America as well, when we were not so well established, and the resources were very scarce, and resources were very limited. So the shaila came about, how do we allocate these limited resources? Should the focus be on chadorim for the children from the Frum family, Shem Yotera Mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael? Or should we also branch out and have day schools for the less affiliated? Where should the focus be? And there was a big debate, and some held that the resources are limited. We're just getting onto our feet. We have to focus now and build a strong, firm foundation for the Chador, and allocate the resources there and make them strong. And a second step will be to branch out further into day schools and to outlying communities. But the first focus should be Yerushalayim B'nai Brak, and second step to branch out further. But Rav Aaron Zatzal held that no, we have to take the challenge, we have to take the plunge, and we have to spread out the schools and spread out the schools further as well. And there was a big debate going on, but ultimately Rav Aaron, his opinion carried the day. And lo and behold, they were matzliach. They were matzliach to build a chadorim, and matzliach to build a network of schools for the less affiliated. And they were matzliach to do it all. And somehow, miraculously, the resources were found, the funds were found, and that Pach Shemen was not depleted. The Shemen, the resources that were needed, stretched and pulled, and were not depleted, and were able to accommodate it all. So they asked Rav Yaakov afterwards, Zatzal afterwards, what he thinks really, and looking in hindsight, in retrospect, was that not the correct decision? Wasn't it the right decision that they should have spread out and not focus on just the chadorim? He said as follows. He said, as far as what the correct mahalach is, b'derech hateva and seichel, and what really, how the approach should be, he said the responsible approach would have been to focus on the chador. That b'derech haseichel, b'derech hateva, that would have been the responsible approach and the correct approach. We see that really there were enough resources to go around and do everything. He said that's something different. That came about as from the Mesiras Nefesh of Rav Aaron. That came about from Rav Aaron's Mesiras Nefesh. B'derech hateva, b'derech seichel hayosher, the right approach is to focus and not to risk the fledgling kihila, the community that is trying to build the chadorim, etc. That would have been seichel hayosher. What carried the day and the success that they had, and that the resources stretched, and that the pach was not depleted, that's Rav Aaron's Mesiras Nefesh. Through the Mesiras Nefesh of Rav Aaron, the oil was replenished. Klal Yisrael has that koyach. When called upon, if we exert the Mesiras Nefesh that's required, the Rabbeinu Shalom